I married a filthy stranger in the street to destroy. My mother's scheme, he was the wealthiest lord in all of Scotland. The morning my mother announced I would marry Lord Harwick, I felt the walls of our estate close in around me like a coffin being sealed shut. I had been standing at the window when she said it, watching the frost-covered garden below, the bare rose bushes my grandmother had planted 30 years ago, the iron gate that separated our crumbling world from the village beyond. I remember thinking, in that strange way your mind works when it receives news, too large to process immediately, that the roses would bloom again in spring, that the world would keep moving regardless of what happened to me inside these walls. He is 63 years old, Eleanor, I said, turning from the window. My voice was steady. My hands, hidden in the folds of my skirt, were not. My mother, Lady Cecilia Ashford, sat at the head of the breakfast table with the composed expression she wore when she had already decided something and was merely informing the furniture. She stirred her tea in slow, deliberate circles. He is also extraordinarily wealthy, she said. And we are not. The roof of the east wing leaked again last night. The creditors have written twice this month. You're 22 years old, Eleanor. This is not a complicated situation. I am a person, I said quietly. Not a solution to a financial problem. She set down her spoon. You are both, she said. And you will do what is necessary for this family. Do what is necessary. That phrase had governed my entire life. It was the reason I had given up my place at the Edinburgh Academy when I was 17, because the fees were too high and my presence at home was more useful. It was the reason I had smiled at dinner parties I hated, charmed men I despised, and folded myself smaller and smaller until I sometimes forgot what shape I had originally been. Lord Harwick had buried 2 wives. The village women whispered about it. In the way they whispered about things, they couldn't prove but thoroughly believed. He had a cold smile and warm hands, and he had looked at me at the autumn gala, the way a man looks at a painting he intends to purchase. I had 3 days before the formal engagement contract would be signed. I spent the first day crying, quietly in my room, with my face pressed into my pillow like I was 17 again, and the world was ending for the first time. I spent the second day thinking, which was more productive, though not by much. I walked the length of the east corridor 14 times, sat in my grandmother's chair by the fire, and turned the problem over and over in my mind like a stone I was hoping would eventually reveal something useful underneath. On the 3rd morning I woke before dawn with a single thought already fully formed, as though my sleeping mind had worked through it while I rested. If I am already married, the contract means nothing. It was reckless. It was possibly the most impulsive idea I had ever entertained. And I had once climbed onto the estate roof at midnight, because I wanted to see the stars without the tree line blocking them. But it was also in the cold gray light of early morning. The only idea that made any sense. I dressed in my plainest clothes, a dark wool dress, sensible boots, a heavy cloak the color of dried mulberries. I left before my mother was awake. I walked through the iron gate and down the lane into the village of Dunmore with my heart hammering, and my mind made up. The village was quiet in the winter morning. The market stalls were setting up. Along the square, bread and root, vegetables and bolts of rough cloth. A blacksmith's hammer rang out from the far end of the lane. Women in heavy skirts moved between stalls with baskets, their breath fogging in the cold air, their conversations low and unhurried. Normal life, carrying on with magnificent indifference to the crisis occurring inside my chest. I walked the length of the square twice, looking for someone, though I couldn't have told you precisely what I was looking for. A kind face, perhaps. Someone who looked trustworthy and unbothered, and free enough to agree to something extraordinary before noon. That's when I saw him. He was leaning against the stone wall near the old well at the far end of the square, arms folded across his chest, completely still in a way that most people aren't. He wore a military coat, deep green once probably, now so battered and weathered and stained that it barely held its color. His dark hair was unwashed and pushed back from his face without care. His jaw was heavy with several days of unshaved growth. His boots were caked in dried mud that had cracked and layered over itself, like the rings of an old tree. The people of Dunmore moved around him the way Water moves around a stone, with practiced, unconscious avoidance. A beggar, I thought, or a soldier down on his luck, or both. And then the thought that changed everything. He would do. I walked across the square before I could think better of it. He watched me approach with gray eyes that were startlingly alert. The color of a Highland loch in November. Still and deep and not quite cold. Up close I could see that he was younger than I'd first assumed. 30 perhaps, maybe slightly less, and there was something in his face that didn't match. His clothes, a quiet self-possession, a steadiness, as though the disorder of his appearance were external and temporary while something underneath remained entirely unmoved. "I need a husband," I said. "Today, within the hour, if at all possible." He looked at me for a long moment. He didn't laugh. He didn't step back. He simply looked, with the focused attention of someone who has learned to evaluate situations quickly and without the interference of surprise. "That's an unusual request," he said. His voice was low and measured with the soft shadow of a Highland accent underneath the words. "I'm entirely aware," I said. "I'll explain everything once you've agreed. But I need an answer now because time is genuinely a factor here. There's a priest at the chapel on Miller Street who owes my grandmother a considerable favor. We can be married before noon if we leave within the next 15 minutes. "And after noon?" he asked. "After noon, the arrangement is entirely up to you. You're free to leave, free to stay, free to do whatever you were planning to do before I interrupted you. I only need the marriage certificate and a witness signature. I have some savings and not a significant amount. But I can compensate you for your time and trouble." "Keep your money," he said. My heart sank. "Then you're refusing." "I didn't say that." He pushed off the wall and straightened to his full height, which was enough that I had to adjust my gaze upward. He looked down the length of the square at the frost-dusted cobblestones, the thin pale sky, the ordinary morning continuing without drama in every direction. Then he looked back at me. "I'll marry you." I released a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. "You don't even know my name." "No," he agreed. "You haven't told me." "Eleanor Ashford." "Callum Rain," he said, and he held out his arm, not with ceremony but with a simple practical courtesy, as though we were about to walk into a dinner party rather than a chapel. "Shall we?" We were married at 11:47 in the morning. The priest, Father Donnelly, a round-faced man who had known my grandmother since they were both young and owed her, apparently, an endless debt of unnamed favors, performed. The ceremony in the small side chapel with its cold stone floors and 3 flickering candles, an elderly woman named Mrs. McPhee, who had come inside to warm herself and stayed, because she had excellent instincts for when something interesting was about to happen, served as our second witness. I signed my name. Callum signed his, in handwriting that was clean and deliberate, and suggested considerably more education than his appearance implied. The priest read the words. It was done. I walked home with a marriage certificate folded inside my cloak and a stranger's last name, sitting strangely in my mind, like furniture rearranged in a room I thought I knew. My mother's reaction exceeded every expectation I had set for it. She went pale, then flushed, then pale again in a sequence that I might have found almost interesting under different circumstances. She read the certificate 3 times, each time with increasing pressure on the paper, as though rereading it hard enough might change what it said. She called me ungrateful. She called me reckless. She said several other things I will not record here because they reflect poorly on everyone involved, including the room. Lord Harwick's representative arrived at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. He was a thin man with a leather satchel and the tired expression of someone accustomed to delivering news that other people found disappointing. He reviewed the certificate, asked 2 clarifying questions, received 2 clear answers, and left at 4:15. There was nothing to negotiate. The contract had no ground to stand on. I sat in my bedroom that evening listening to the house settle around me in the winter quiet. I had expected to feel triumphant. I felt instead something quieter and stranger than triumph, something that took me a while to identify as relief. Not the temporary kind, the kind that comes when a danger passes and then the anxiety returns. A deeper kind, the kind that lives in your bones. For the first time in longer than I could clearly remember, I had done something entirely my own. I didn't think much about Callum Rain after that. I thought occasionally, with a small uncomfortable guilt, that I had pulled a stranger into my crisis and left him to walk back out of it alone. But I told myself he had agreed freely, that I had offered compensation he had declined, and that whatever his reasons had been, they had been his own. The letter arrived 4 days later. It came in a thick cream envelope with a wax seal I didn't recognize, a Highland stag on a crest I had never seen before. It was addressed to Lady Eleanor Rain, which brought me to a complete stop in the hallway, because I had nearly managed to forget that was my name now. The letter was from a firm of Edinburgh solicitors. It was written in the careful, measured language of people who regularly deal with large sums of money and have learned to deliver significant information without inflection. It informed me that my husband, Mr. Callum James Rain, had been successfully located after an extended period of voluntary absence, and that the firm was prepared to proceed with the formal transfer and documentation of his inherited estate at his earliest convenience. Glencairn, 47,000 acres of highland land, 2 fully operational working estates, a title that had been sitting unclaimed, waiting for its lord to return, from a war he had never wanted to fight and a grief he had needed time to carry before he could set it down. I read the letter 4 times, then I sat down on the hallway floor, which was cold and undignified and seemed, under the circumstances, entirely appropriate. My mother found out within 2 hours. I heard her from across the house, a sound I had never heard, her make before and hope never to hear again, something between devastation and the specific anguish of a woman who has just understood the full scale of her own miscalculation. Callum came to the door himself 3 days later. He looked different without the battered coat and the layers of road dust, or rather, he looked like the same person finally visible without obstruction. Simple, well-cut clothes, the dark hair washed and settled, the same gray eyes, the same particular stillness. He looked like a man who had never needed to prove anything to anyone and had spent some time in places that had confirmed this. "I owe you an explanation," he said, standing on the doorstep in the thin winter light. "You agreed to help a stranger in a desperate situation," I said. "I don't think explanations are required." "I knew who I was when I agreed," he said. "I want you to understand that. I wasn't trying to deceive you. I had walked out of the solicitor's office in Edinburgh 3 days before, and I just kept walking. I wasn't ready to step back into the life everyone had mapped out for me. The title, the estate, the expectations, a pause, and then you walked across a village square and asked me to marry you, and it was the first completely honest, completely unplanned thing that had happened to me in years." I was quiet for a moment. "You never asked me why," I said. "That morning. You never asked me to explain myself. You would have told me when you were ready," he said simply. I looked at him, this man who had signed his name, next to mine in a cold chapel without asking a single question that could have waited, who had declined payment and walked away and let me have my secret for as long as I needed it. "My mother was going to sell me to settle her debts," I said. Lord Harwick was 63 years old and had buried 2 wives and looked at me like inventory. Something moved across his face, not pity, which I couldn't have borne, but something quieter and more serious. Anger held at a careful distance. "And now," he said. "And now," I said, "I'd like to see Glencairn. If that's an appropriate thing to ask." He held out his hand. Not a command, not an assumption, just an open hand waiting. I took it. We rode north the following morning through a landscape that seemed to have been designed specifically to make human problems feel appropriately small. Silver frost on the moorland. Pale winter sky stretched vast and unhurried overhead. The highland hills rising dark and patient in the distance. Glencairn emerged from the morning mist the way certain things do when they've been waiting. Long enough, not dramatically, but with a quiet, settled certainty. Grey stone, green hills, a history longer and deeper than either of us. I stood at the gate and understood for the first time that running away from something and running toward something can begin with the exact same steps, that a reckless idea pursued with enough conviction can occasionally become the truest thing you've ever done. My mother never apologized, but she never again spoke of what was necessary for the family. Some things, it turns out, are only necessary until the moment you finally decide they are not.